Hey Chris, glad to have you with us today. Would you mind telling our audiences a bit about yourself to begin with?
I'm a newspaper editor in Connecticut in the United States. I've really been in the newspaper business since I got out of high school. I write a political column that's published in other newspapers in Connecticut and in Rhode Island, and I fell into the gold business sort of by accident back in late 1998 when I ran into the internet site of what is now Gada's chairman, Bill Murphy, and I had a trial subscription to Jim Blanchard's gold newsletter, and I got interested in the gold business then. And when we began to realize that the gold market was being manipulated, that triggered more of my interest, because my newspaper is a family-owned newspaper, and we'd had to fight some big chain-owned newspapers for certain syndicated features, and so we had to get some experience in antitrust law, which is really what I brought to the whole endeavor. When Bill was writing that the gold market was rigged, I told him if it was rigged, it was against the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act and 50 state antitrust acts in the United States, and that somebody ought to form a committee to hire a law firm to sue the bastards and collect triple damages under antitrust law, and that if somebody wanted to start such a committee, I would donate $500 to it. And Bill thought that was a good idea, and that's where Gada came from.
So tell us a bit more about Gada. What is Gada's objective?
Gada's objective really is to expose and really stop, if we can, the manipulation, the rigging of the gold market and related markets in secret by central banks. We feel that this market rigging is part of a comprehensive scheme by central banks really to rig all markets now, including the commodity markets. We believe that this is not only a matter of deceiving investors, defrauding the world, it's destructive of all markets. And if you believe, as we do, that free markets are the great engines of human progress and liberty, then market rigging by central banks is a great crime. It's a crime against humanity, and that's why we want to expose it and to stop it.
So building on that, what do you think are some of the underlying motives behind the secrecy and the manipulation of the gold markets?
It's all a matter of power. Gold is money. Gold is a currency. It was the world reserve currency, and I think it's likely to become the world reserve currency again. Since it is a currency, it competes with government currencies. Central banks hate their competitors. Further, the price of gold has an enormous influence on interest rates and government bond prices. Central banks throughout history have always tried to suppress the gold price in order to support their own currencies, to support their own government bond prices. They used to suppress the gold price more in the open, as they did through the London Gold Pool in the 1960s. The London Gold Pool was an open public scheme of coordinated dishoarding of Western Bank gold reserves to hold the U.S. gold price at $35 an ounce. They began to run out of gold in early 1968, and they had to close the London Gold Pool, and the gold price broke free for a while. Then the central banks regrouped and realized that they could control the gold price through derivatives, through futures, options, high-frequency trading, and that's the rigging that we have now. And because it is done in secret, they don't have to distort as much real metal. They preserve the metal that they need for their own reserves and really for some market rigging purposes. But now this rigging is done in secret. We believe that if we can expose this market rigging and its mechanisms to enough people and to enough participants in the market, we will blow up the scheme, because the scheme cannot work if the market understands it.
So building on this idea, could you give our audiences a glimpse into the sort of actions that central banks might take? Do they go through agents? Do they go through other banks? What what sort of actions are in place for them to manipulate?
Their main undertaking in recent years has been to underwrite the creation of a vast amount of imaginary gold in the market, paper gold. People disparage gold, saying that it has not kept up with inflation in recent decades, and that's true. Of course, nobody in the mainstream financial media asks why gold has not kept up with inflation. Well, the reason is that central banks have underwritten this creation of a vast supply of certificate gold that doesn't exist. They've created a fractional reserve gold banking system. They do it through two agents. They do it through investment banks that function as bullion banks. They also do it through the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of the central banks. This is not conspiracy theory. You can see that the bullion banks have huge, unsupportable gold derivative positions in their futures trading, as reported to the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And all you have to do is look at the annual report of the Bank for International Settlements, which states very candidly that it trades gold and gold futures and options and other gold derivatives on behalf of its member central banks. In fact, a few years ago, GATA publicized a PowerPoint presentation that was created by the Bank for International Settlements to induce central banks to join the Bank for International Settlements. And this BIS PowerPoint presentation advertised as being among its services to its member central banks secret interventions in the gold market. So all this stuff is public record. It's not conspiracy theory, but if you want to know how they're doing it through central bank agents in the gold market, which is the bullion banks, and they're doing it through the Bank for International Settlements. They're also doing it through other central banks. 2 years ago, the Director of Market Operations for the Banque de France, Alexandre Gautier, gave a speech to the London Bullion Market Association meeting in Rome, in which he said that the Banque de France is trading gold for its own account and for the accounts of other central banks nearly on a daily basis. Those were his words, nearly on a daily basis. When a bullion dealer, at my suggestion, contacted Gautier to ask him, well, what is the objective of this trading? Why are central banks doing all this secret gold trading? Gautier replied very cordially that we never talk about that kind of thing. But this is on the record. Central banks do it directly, they do it through the BIS, and they do it through bullion banks.
So we had the LIBOR scandal a couple of years ago. Behavior-wise, do you think anything has changed in the gold market manipulation since then?
Yes, I think it's intensified. I think the strain in the gold market is getting greater. Offtake for private demand is getting greater. Offtake for central bank demand is increasing. We know Russia and China particularly have been increasing their gold reserves, and I think as a result, the suppression of the gold price, at least the gold futures price, has intensified. And I think the giveaway of all this was the great gold smash of April 2013, where really in a matter of 2 days, the gold price was driven down about $200. Until that point, everybody was saying that there was a Chinese put under the gold price, that China would buy any little dip and keep the price supported. Well, the idea of a Chinese put was exploded in April 2013 when the price was smashed down. And it occurred to me then that something very much had changed. You realize that China, with its 3 or 4 trillion in dollars in foreign exchange reserves, is able to run any market in the world that it wants to. I realized at that point in April that, wait a minute, nothing this big as the gold price smash of April 2013 could have happened without China's complicity, or at least its complicity, possibly with its very active involvement. Since that time, certain experts, I know Jim Rickards is very well known. I'll mention him. But there's increasing speculation, for which I think there's good evidence, that as of April 2013, the United States and China reached an agreement under which China would not crash the treasury bond market by unloading treasuries if the United States would help it keep the gold price down. So over a longer term, China could buy gold at a lower price to hedge its exposure in U.S. debt instruments. Now, both sides, the United States and China, have the other in a compromised position. China can destroy the treasury market anytime it wants to by selling or by buying a lot of gold at once. But both sides would suffer from that. If China crashes the treasury bond market, it's cutting its own throat because there goes most of its reserves. I think the Chinese strategy is to gradually unload its treasuries in favor of acquiring gold so that its treasury position is hedged, but it can't go into the gold market too heavily or it'll explode the gold price and the scheme will not work. I think this speculation fits very closely with a paper that was written by two U.S. Economists and fund managers a few years ago, Paul Brodsky and Lee Quaintance. Brodsky and Quaintance speculated that there was very likely a scheme among all major central banks to redistribute the world's gold reserves more fairly among central banks so that central banks that had a disproportionate US dollar debt instrument surplus would be able to hedge themselves with gold. Brodsky and Quaintance argued that gold investors should not see central banks as the terrible enemies of gold, certainly as I do, but as interveners in the market that eventually were going to drive the gold price up. Brodsky and Quaintance thought that once the central banks had redistributed gold among central banks in a quiet, gradual way, they would drive the price way up and reliquefy themselves that way and devalue their currencies simultaneously. I think that's a very plausible scenario, but it still relies on market rigging. And since it relies on market rigging, I could not be any more opposed to it than I am now. If central banks are intervening in markets in secret, we don't have any markets. No individual investor can trade against a central bank. A central bank creates infinite money. If a central bank is in a market surreptitiously, as we know central banks are in the gold market, and not only in the gold market, we know from CFTC and SEC documents, they're in all the futures markets in the United States, including the commodity futures markets. If central banks are in a market surreptitiously, there are no markets anymore. There's just interventions, and we have lost our market economy, and that's a catastrophe for the world.
In recent years, we've seen some countries, like Germany, try to repatriate their gold. Do you feel that this is causing a bit of conflict in central bank planning? Do you think this is a step away from a cohesive strategy? What are your thoughts on that?
It could be, except if Germany really wanted all its gold back and wanted it now or tomorrow or next week, Germany could make a big stink about that. Germany, the Bundesbank, is not making a big stink about that. So I have to assume that Germany has been swapping and leasing gold with the United States for many years and is still basically cooperating with the other central banks in the management of the gold price and the rearrangement of world gold reserves. Now, the Bundesbank may be reluctant to crash the system by grabbing for all its gold at once for two reasons. In the first place, it probably could not get the gold back all at once. It's probably too compromised and impaired, hypothecated and rehypothecated by the New York Federal Reserve. But secondly, if Germany was to make a stink by grabbing for repatriation of all its gold at once, there would probably be a disclosure through the United States or through Germany itself that Germany has been playing the gold price suppression scheme for a long time. We know back when Arthur Burns was chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States in the 1970s, he wrote a letter to President Ford explaining that he had a secret agreement with the Bundesbank that was concurred in by the West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, that Germany would not buy gold in the private market for anything besides the official US dollar price of $42.22 an ounce. That signified that Germany was part of the gold price suppression scheme as far back as 1974. I'm sure the Bundesbank is still cooperating with it now, perhaps resentfully, but is still cooperating. They could get their gold back tomorrow, or they could ask for it tomorrow, but if they did, they'd be held to pay.
What do you think is happening behind the scenes this year, in 2016, that our audiences should be aware of?
Well, I think first, there's increasing strain in the gold market. We see signs of it almost every day. We see attempts to smash the gold futures price. You know, a few years ago, there'd be intervention in the gold market. It would knock the gold price down very heavily, and it would stay down for weeks, if not months. Now there's these attempts to smash the gold price down, and it just doesn't stay down very long. It's very resilient lately. That's an indication of strain in the market. What Bill Murphy and at his internet site calls the 1% rule, the 2% rule, that's the daily limit on increases in the gold futures price. That seems to be violated more often. So there's, you know, indications in the market like that. But I think there's also just a lot more speculation that central banks are reallocating gold reserves among themselves, and I think there is more attention in the media to possible intervention in the gold market. There's a lot more discussion. It's not terribly well informed, it's not detailed, but there's a lot more reporting of suspicions of manipulation of the gold market, which has changed. When GATA got started, we could barely stick our heads above ground without being ridiculed. And then we had a few years where nobody would dare ridicule us because they could not address the documentation that we have produced. And now they just don't want to engage with us at all. This is a prohibited topic in North America. It's available for discussion in certain circles in Europe, certainly in Asia. I mean, we know from the WikiLeaks cables in 2011 that the Chinese government knows all about the gold price suppression scheme. I mean, I'm in Asia this week precisely because there are some people here, including yourself, but others, who will actually listen to me. I spoke at the Mines and Money conference in Hong Kong last week. I'm speaking at the Mining Investment Asia conference here in Singapore this week. I was interviewed in Hong Kong by CNBC and Bloomberg Radio. The latter was really unprecedented for me. I've been interviewed here in Singapore today by Bloomberg TV and Thomson Reuters and the Times of India for a broadcast that was broadcast throughout India. I think if you're outside North America, more and more people are learning that something is not right in the gold market. I don't think the market has all the details yet. I don't think they've gone through GATA's archive, but I think the word is spreading. I am sorry that we have not been able to spread it, you know, faster. I mean, we've been at this for 16 years, and I think we're just preaching a tautology. Central banks intervene in the gold market all the time. They used to do it in the open. Now they do it secretly because it costs them less gold when they do it secretly. But I think recognition is growing, and that is changing. The Russian central bank has acknowledged gold market rigging in a subtle way. The Chinese government has acknowledged it in a very open, brazen way. We know from the WikiLeaks cables. If Russia knows, if China knows, if a growing number of investors knows in Asia, in Europe, then I think things are changing. And certainly I am grateful to BullionStar for the work that BullionStar has done in this respect. Your researchers, Koos Jansen and Ronan Manley, are the top experts on the planet in their fields, if you ask me. GATA has been honored to publicize their work. They have come up with just absolutely devastating disclosures about the gold price suppression scheme. So, some very important, crucial work has been done, right in this shop. This is a guerrilla revolutionary movement, but guerrilla revolutionary movements sometimes win. And I think if we're doing the right thing, we will win. I don't know if I'm going to live to see that day. I think you will live to see that day. I think Torgny will live to see that day. And I'll resent the hell out of you for having lived longer than I did after all the work I did. But nevertheless, we don't know when it's going to happen. But I do think in the end, truth and justice will prevail. The ascent of man will continue. And I just don't know when it's going to happen. But this is a fight worth waging. It's a fight against totalitarianism and parasitism and imperialism, and it's a fight for human liberty. And I hope I've done the right thing. I think I have.
Chris, that was a wonderful note to end this conversation on. Very, very insightful stuff. It's been a pleasure having you here with us.
Oh, my pleasure.